The sun was slowly setting over Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, casting long shadows across the bustling terminal as passengers hurried to board their flights. The energy in the air was palpable, everyone eager to reach their destinations, to finally be home. Among the crowd was a woman who stood apart, not because she was different, but because she embodied everything that was often overlooked. Sergeant Lorraine Bryant, a combat medic and decorated U.S. Army veteran, had just returned from a brutal deployment overseas. As she walked toward the gate, the clack of her combat boots echoed softly on the airport floor. Her uniform was immaculate, yet there was a quiet weariness in her posture, a fatigue that went deeper than the long flight she had just endured. Her eyes were focused, determined, but those who looked closely would catch a flicker of exhaustion, the kind that only months of separation from home could bring. Lorraine's mind was already far from the crowded terminal. All she wanted was to sit down, close her eyes, and imagine the warmth of her family's embrace, a comfort she hadn't felt in far too long. She boarded the plane and took her seat, her uniform drawing a mix of looks from the other passengers. Some offered quiet nods of respect, a simple acknowledgement of the sacrifice she had made, but others avoided her gaze entirely. It didn't matter. Lorraine was used to being invisible, to being reduced to just the uniform she wore and not the person she was. However, there was one person who couldn't help but notice her, though for all the wrong reasons. The man seated just a row behind her seemed to have already formed an opinion before she'd even settled into her seat. From the moment she passed by him, his eyes narrowed in judgment, his lips curling into a sneer. He was the kind of man who made sure his opinions were heard, no matter how loudly or aggressively they needed to be voiced. As the plane began to fill with passengers, the man's voice cut through the ambient noise. It was sharp, filled with disdain, and it carried like a blade through the cabin. "Figures," he scoffed, loud enough for several passengers to hear, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Of course, they'll let just anyone wear the uniform these days." Lorraine's hands froze for a brief moment as she stowed her bag above her seat. She could feel his eyes on her, the weight of his judgment pressing in. She didn't react, though. Instead, she focused on the small photo she had tucked into her jacket pocket, a snapshot of her children, smiling at a 4th of July picnic. The image was her anchor, the one thing that kept her grounded. She breathed in deeply, refusing to let the man's words shake her. But the man wasn't done. "I don't even know why they bother," he continued, his voice rising, cutting through the quiet murmur of the cabin. "What's she even doing? Handing out Band-Aids? She's never seen real action." Lorraine's jaw tightened, but she remained silent. She had heard worse in her years of service. The harsh words of strangers, the unsolicited opinions of those who had never been in her shoes, they were nothing new. What stung, however, was the complete ignorance of his words, the presumption that he knew her without knowing a thing about her. Despite the blatant disrespect, Lorraine didn't defend herself. She didn't need to. Her actions, the lives she had saved, the risks she had taken, spoke louder than any insult could. But still, his voice lingered in the air, a poison that was slowly seeping into the cabin. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging awkward glances, but no one spoke up. Lorraine kept her focus on the photo, tracing her fingers along the edge of it, finding a semblance of peace in the midst of the tension. The man, clearly relishing the attention his tirade was garnering, leaned back in his seat, his posture smug. "Real soldiers," he continued, his voice now more theatrical. "The ones who do the real work don't need a parade. It's all for show these days." Lorraine's fingers tightened around the photo in her lap, but she remained stoic. The woman sitting beside her, a young mother with a toddler on her lap, leaned over and whispered softly, "Are you okay?" Lorraine nodded, offering a smile that was small but genuine. She didn't need to defend herself to a stranger. She knew who she was, what she had done, and that was enough. Still, the man's words continued to echo in her mind, rattling around in the silence between the cracks of the conversation. Why did people like him feel entitled to tear others down without knowing a single thing about them? The flight attendant, a petite woman with an expression that combined warmth and exhaustion, walked down the aisle. As she passed Lorraine's row, her eyes flicked between the soldier and the man, sensing the rising tension. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, her voice professional but firm. "Oh, everything's fine," the man replied with a mocking grin. "Just making an observation. Hope I'm not offending anyone's delicate feelings." The flight attendant's lips tightened slightly, but she nodded and moved on. Lorraine could tell she was aware of the situation, but unsure of how to diffuse the tension. For her part, Lorraine let out a slow breath. She had dealt with people like this before, the kind who would push boundaries just to see how far they could go. And she had learned, through years of experience, when to respond and when to let silence speak for itself. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Lorraine closed her eyes, leaning back in her seat. The man's words continued to reverberate in her mind, but she blocked them out. She had been through far worse. She had faced the real horrors of war, the unthinkable tragedies that shaped her into who she was today. And yet, somehow, the quiet disrespect of a stranger on a plane stung in a way that the battlefield never had. Her thoughts drifted far from the cabin, far from the man's ignorance. They carried her back to Afghanistan, to the dusty, sun-baked landscape where every moment was a battle for survival. The memories came flooding back, the chaos of a convoy ambush, the deafening roar of an IED explosion, the frantic need to save those around her, even as shrapnel tore into her own body. There, in the desert, she had been more than just a medic. She had been a lifeline, a steady hand in a world where seconds could mean life or death. She thought of the 19-year-old soldier she had saved that day, his legs shattered, his face pale from blood loss. She had refused to let him die. He survived because of her, because she made the decision to act, to save him, even under enemy fire. But it wasn't just the soldiers she had saved. It was the innocent lives caught in the crossfire of a war they never asked for. She remembered the young girl, no older than 7, who had been injured in a mortar attack. Lorraine had carried her to safety, singing softly to calm her as they waited for help to arrive. The memory of that little girl's smile, despite the pain, stayed with Lorraine, a reminder of why she did what she did. It wasn't for the recognition or the medals. It was for moments like that, for the lives that could be saved when someone cared enough to act. Back in the plane, Lorraine opened her eyes. The man was flipping through a magazine, seemingly satisfied with the trouble he had caused. Lorraine didn't feel anger or hatred toward him. Those were heavy burdens to carry, but she did feel a quiet resolve. He didn't know her story, and likely never would, but his ignorance didn't change who she was or what she had done. She had earned her place in this world, not through words or recognition, but through actions. But sometimes, the universe has a way of bringing truths to light in ways no one expects. The next morning, Mark Reynolds sat in his small living room in Albuquerque, the sunlight gently streaming through the blinds, casting soft shadows across the room. His usual routine unfolded in familiar rhythms: coffee brewing, a brief breakfast, and the mindless scrolling of his phone. The day felt like every other day, until it wasn't. As he clicked on the morning news, something unusual caught his attention. The anchor's voice, usually a comforting hum in the background, carried a tone of solemn reverence. "This morning, we honor a true American hero," the anchor began, her voice steady and respectful. Sergeant Lorraine Bryant, a combat medic who risked her life to save not only her fellow soldiers, but countless civilians during her deployment overseas. Mark froze, his coffee cup suspended mid-air. The words didn't fully register at first, and then the screen shifted, and his eyes locked onto the image of the woman in uniform. It was her, the woman from the plane. The image on the screen was almost haunting. The same calm yet powerful presence, the same poised expression, but there was more in her eyes now. There was a story there that he hadn't bothered to consider, hadn't even given a second thought to. The newscaster's voice continued, detailing Lorraine's harrowing experiences overseas. Mark's stomach twisted with an unfamiliar discomfort as he watched the news report unfold. The anchor spoke of the ambush on the convoy, the gunfire, and the blast of an IED that had torn through the air. Lorraine, undeterred by the chaos around her, had sprinted toward danger, pulling injured soldiers from the wreckage as shrapnel tore through her own leg. Her bravery had been nothing short of extraordinary. But it wasn't just the soldiers she had saved. The report revealed how Lorraine had gone above and beyond, treating civilians caught in the crossfire. Villagers who had never asked for war, yet were caught in its aftermath. One of the villagers, a woman speaking through a translator, shared her gratitude. "She saved my daughter. If not for her, we would have lost everything. She has a heart of gold." Mark's chest tightened. The weight of his actions from the day before hit him like a freight train. His own words echoed through his mind. What's she even doing? Handing out band-aids? How could he have been so blind, so callous? Here was a woman who had risked her life over and over again, not just for soldiers, but for innocent people who had never asked for the violence around them. And he had mocked her, dismissed her sacrifice as insignificant. The news report continued, listing Lorraine's numerous commendations, including a Bronze Star for her extraordinary bravery in combat. As Mark stared at the screen, he felt the shame settle in his gut. This woman, who he had so carelessly insulted the day before, was a hero. A true hero, one who didn't wear her heroism on her sleeve but carried it silently through every action, every choice. And he had torn her down for no reason other than his own ignorance and pride. The room felt suddenly too small, the air thick with the guilt that swelled inside him. Mark sank back into his chair, the weight of his shame almost too much to bear. He had always prided himself on being a man who understood the world, someone who saw through the surface and could judge a person for who they truly were. But now, he realized how wrong he had been. He hadn't understood her at all. His mind raced, replaying the moments from the flight. The way he had mocked her, the way she had endured his words in silence. He had assumed that because she wore a uniform, she was just like every other soldier he'd seen on TV. Someone who had no real story, no real depth. But now he knew how wrong he was. Her story was one of unimaginable courage, sacrifice, and resilience. And he had reduced her to a target for his petty, misguided assumptions. Mark's thoughts spiraled. He couldn't undo the harm he had caused, couldn't take back the cruel words he had spoken. They were out there now, witnessed by a cabin full of strangers. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had to do something. He had to try, even if it was just for his own peace of mind. He reached for his phone, hesitating for a moment before typing in Lorraine Bryant's name. The search results flooded the screen. Articles, interviews, even a few blog posts about her remarkable service. He read them all, his hands trembling as he scrolled through the pages. Each story was more heart-wrenching than the last, detailing the lives she had saved, the lives she had touched, and each word stung, reminding him of the insult he had thrown her way, unaware of what she had truly done. He couldn't stop reading. Every story about Lorraine made his guilt more profound. He had called her actions for show, but it was clear now that her actions were anything but that. They were a testament to her strength, to the life she had built for herself through sacrifice and courage. And Mark had failed to recognize that. He had failed to give her the respect she deserved. Hours passed in a haze. Mark's mind kept returning to the same question. How could he make things right? What could he possibly do to fix the harm he had caused? He thought about reaching out to the airline, sending a message to Lorraine through their customer service. But what could he say? The apology felt too small, too inadequate for what he had done. The words, "I'm sorry," didn't seem to carry the weight of his actions, didn't convey the depth of his remorse. Instead, Mark decided to take action in a way that felt more meaningful. He made a donation to a veterans organization, one that supported soldiers returning home from deployment. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a step, however imperfect, toward atonement. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough to right the wrong he had done. He needed to do more. So, he did something he had never done before. He wrote a letter to Lorraine Bryant. In the letter, he poured out his apology, raw and unfiltered. He explained that he had seen her story on the news, that it had opened his eyes in a way he hadn't expected. He acknowledged his mistake, his ignorance, and how profoundly sorry he was for the way he had treated her. The letter ended with words that felt both too simple and too powerful. "You didn't deserve my hate. You deserved my respect, and I failed to give it to you. I will carry the weight of that failure for the rest of my life, but I promise to do better. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your bravery. And thank you for being a better person than I ever was. Mark didn't know if Lorraine would ever receive the letter. He didn't know if she would ever read it. But he knew that writing it was a step, perhaps the only step he could take. It wasn't about trying to ease his own guilt. It wasn't about making himself feel better. It was about accepting responsibility for his actions and striving to be better. Days passed, and Mark's mind returned to Lorraine often. He thought about her strength, her resilience, the quiet dignity with which she had endured his cruelty. He thought about how, in that moment on the plane, she hadn't fought back with words. She hadn't stooped to his level. She had let her silence speak for her, and it had spoken louder than any insult could. Mark knew now that true strength wasn't just about enduring hardship. It was about confronting your own flaws, acknowledging your mistakes, and striving to do better. Lorraine had shown him that. And maybe, just maybe, he could start living his life with the same courage she had shown every day. A week later, Mark sat in the same chair, staring out the window. He didn't know if Lorraine had ever received his letter, and he didn't know if she ever would. But something had shifted within him. He had learned something important, something he had never been willing to see before. Everyone has a story, and those stories often carry burdens heavier than most people can imagine. The least you can do is offer respect, even when you don't fully understand. Especially then. Mark wasn't a hero. He wasn't even sure if he'd ever be one. But in that moment, he knew that he could be better. He could listen more, judge less, and treat others with the respect they deserved. As viewers, we often hear stories about heroes like Lorraine Bryant and assume they're distant, untouchable figures. But the truth is, they walk among us every day, on flights, in grocery stores, in our neighborhoods. Sometimes we don't even realize their significance until it's too late. This story, though, is a reminder that the people we often overlook may be the ones who teach us the most. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on how you treat the people around you. Let's strive to lead with kindness, understanding, and respect. And if you believe in sharing messages like this one, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more stories that challenge the way we see the world.